Get that black girl out of first class. Rebecca Miller's voice cut through the cabin like a blade. She was staring at 17-year-old Alyssa Carter, who was quietly working on her laptop in seat 2A. She obviously doesn't belong here, Rebecca continued, loud enough for other passengers to hear. Probably used a stolen credit card. Alyssa had heard these words her whole life. But today was different. Flight 447 from JFK to San Francisco was supposed to be routine. Alyssa kept typing, trying to ignore the blonde woman in 2B with her designer bag and entitled attitude. How does someone like that afford first class? Rebecca's voice got louder. The words hit like a slap. Alyssa felt eyes turning toward her from across the cabin. Some passengers looked uncomfortable. Others seemed curious about the drama unfolding. She'd learned to keep her dignity when people questioned her right to exist in spaces they considered theirs. Stay calm. Don't react. Let them expose themselves. But Rebecca Miller had picked the wrong teenager to humiliate. What she didn't know was that one phone call was about to change everything. Rebecca Miller settled into first-class seat 2B with the entitled ease of someone accustomed to premium treatment. Her weekly flights between New York and San Francisco had earned her platinum status and the deference of flight crews who knew her by name. She expected a certain type of passenger in first class, people like her, not teenagers in hoodies typing frantically on laptops. Alyssa Carter represented everything Rebecca found unsettling about modern air travel. The girl was young, black, dressed casually, and worst of all, completely comfortable in a space Rebecca considered her domain. When the teenager had boarded with a worn backpack and settled into 2A without a trace of intimidation, Rebecca's assumptions kicked into overdrive. "Excuse me," Rebecca called to flight attendant Sarah Jenkins, a nervous 20-something on her third week of duty. "I think there might be a seating error." Sarah approached with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Is there a problem with your seat, Mrs. Miller?" "Not my seat." Rebecca's voice carried the particular tone of someone accustomed to being heard. "Her seat." She nodded toward Alyssa, who continued coding without acknowledgement. "I fly this route every week. I know the usual clientele." Sarah's discomfort was visible. She'd heard whispers about Rebecca Miller, a frequent flyer whose complaints often centered on passengers who didn't fit her narrow definition of appropriate. But company policy required her to investigate passenger concerns, no matter how uncomfortable they made her feel. "I'll need to verify her boarding pass," Sarah murmured, approaching Alyssa with an apologetic expression. The teenager looked up from her screen, her dark eyes calm and patient. "Is there a problem?" "Just routine verification," Sarah said, though nothing about this felt routine. "Could I see your boarding pass and ID?" Alyssa handed over the documents without protest. Her boarding pass clearly showed seat 2A, first class, paid in full. Her Massachusetts driver's license confirmed her identity. Everything was legitimate, which somehow made Sarah feel worse about the entire interaction. "Thank you," Sarah said, returning the documents. But as she turned away, Rebecca's voice stopped her. "What about how she paid for it? Shouldn't you verify the credit card?" The question landed like a physical blow. Alyssa's composure never wavered, but something shifted in her expression, a hardening around her eyes that suggested she'd reached the limit of her patience with this particular form of discrimination. "Ma'am?" Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her documentation is in order." But Rebecca Miller was just getting started. In her mind, she was protecting the sanctity of first class, maintaining standards, asking reasonable questions. She couldn't see, or chose not to see, the racial undertones of her suspicions. She saw only a young black woman in a space where she didn't belong, and Rebecca Miller had never been one to stay silent about such things. The confrontation escalated with the surgical precision of practiced discrimination. Rebecca Miller had perfected the art of questioning without explicitly stating her assumptions, using coded language that maintained plausible deniability while making her meaning crystal clear. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Rebecca said, her voice carrying to nearby passengers. "But we all know how easy it is to use stolen credit cards online. Shouldn't there be better security measures?" Flight attendant Sarah Jenkins found herself trapped between company policy and common sense. Protocol dictated that passenger concerns be addressed, but every instinct told her this was racial profiling dressed up in safety rhetoric. Her hands trembled slightly as she pretended to review Alyssa's boarding pass again. "Ma'am, everything appears to be in order," Sarah managed. "Appears to be," Rebecca repeated, emphasizing each word. "But how can we be sure? I mean, look at her. Does she look like she belongs in first class?" The words hung in the air like a neon sign advertising bigotry. Several passengers turned to stare, some with curiosity, others with obvious discomfort. Alyssa Carter sat perfectly still, her laptop screen casting a blue glow on her composed features. She'd weathered storms like this before, but never at 35,000 feet with nowhere to escape. Dr. Rajesh Patel, a cardiologist seated across the aisle in 1C, watched the exchange with growing alarm. He'd experienced his own share of in-flight discrimination and recognized the dangerous trajectory of this confrontation. His phone was already recording discreetly, documenting what he suspected would become a significant incident. "I think we should call security," Rebecca announced, her voice rising with manufactured urgency. "I don't feel safe with someone suspicious on the plane." She's been typing constantly. What if she's hacking something? The accusation was absurd, but it carried the weight of post-9/11 paranoia and racial anxiety. Sarah Jenkins looked around desperately for guidance, her training inadequate for navigating such obvious discrimination. Other flight crew members began to gather, sensing trouble but unsure how to diffuse it. Alyssa finally spoke, her voice steady and clear. "Mrs. Miller, I'm a computer science student at MIT. I'm working on my senior project, an AI security system. I'd be happy to show you my code if it would ease your concerns." But Rebecca was beyond reason now, drunk on the power of disruption and the attention of her audience. "Oh, so now she admits she's working on security systems." That sounds even more suspicious. The twisted logic of discrimination had taken hold. Everything Alyssa said would be used against her, every explanation transformed into further evidence of guilt. It was a trap as old as prejudice itself, and Alyssa knew better than to keep feeding it with reasonable responses. Instead, she saved her work, closed her laptop, and waited. Experience had taught her that confronting bigotry head-on often backfired. Sometimes the best strategy was to let people reveal themselves completely, to give them enough rope to hang themselves with their own words and actions. The storm was about to break, and Alyssa Carter sat at its center with the calm of someone who'd learned to find strength in stillness. By the time Air Marshal Tom Reynolds arrived at Row 2, the situation had devolved into a full-scale scene. Rebecca Miller had successfully recruited several passengers to her cause, painting herself as a concerned citizen protecting air travel safety. Her voice carried the righteous indignation of someone convinced of her own virtue. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Rebecca said, her performance reaching theatrical heights. "This girl has been acting suspicious since she boarded, typing constantly, refusing to explain what she's doing, clearly not supposed to be in first class." Reynolds, a 15-year veteran of federal law enforcement, had developed certain assumptions about security threats over his career. Young black passengers typing on laptops in first class fit a profile he'd constructed in his mind. Not of terrorists necessarily, but of people trying to game the system, people who didn't belong. "Miss, I'm going to need you to step aside while I examine your belongings," Reynolds announced, his voice carrying the authority of a federal badge. Alyssa looked up at the Air Marshal with the same calm she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. "Am I under arrest?" "You're under investigation for suspicious activity aboard a commercial aircraft." The words sent a ripple through the first-class cabin. Dr. Patel continued recording, his medical training recognizing the stress signals in Alyssa's controlled breathing despite her outward composure. Other passengers began taking out their phones, sensing they were witnessing something significant. Captain Michael Foster appeared from the cockpit, drawn by reports of a security incident. His 23 years of flying experience had taught him that passenger disputes could escalate quickly at altitude, where emotions ran high and escape was impossible. "What's the situation?" Foster asked Reynolds. "Suspicious passenger, possible security threat. The complaint came from Mrs. Miller here. She's concerned about this passenger's behavior and presence in first class." Foster looked at Alyssa, taking in her MIT hoodie, her calm demeanor, her expensive laptop. Nothing about her screamed security threat, but he'd learned to trust his Air Marshal's judgment. More importantly, he'd learned that the fastest way to resolve passenger disputes was to satisfy the complaining party. "Miss, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and move to coach," Foster announced. "We can sort this out after landing." It was the moment when institutional bias revealed itself fully. Rather than questioning the absurd nature of the accusations, rather than examining the obvious racial undertones of the complaint, the system chose the path of least resistance: remove the black teenager and appease the white woman. Alyssa stood slowly, her movements deliberate and dignified. "Captain Foster, I paid for this seat. I've done nothing wrong. I've answered every question posed to me. I'd like to know exactly what crime I'm suspected of committing." "You're not under arrest," Reynolds interjected, "but you're being moved for the safety and comfort of other passengers." "Whose safety? Whose comfort?" Alyssa's voice remained steady, but steel had entered it. "I've been sitting quietly, working on a school project. The only person who's been disruptive is Mrs. Miller." Rebecca Miller seized the opportunity. "See? She's argumentative, confrontational. This is exactly what I was worried about." The circular logic of prejudice had closed completely. Alyssa's reasonable questions were reframed as aggression. Her calm demeanor was suspicious. Her presence was a problem. Her absence would be a solution. Foster made his decision with the expedience of someone more concerned with schedule than justice. "Miss, you can move to coach voluntarily, or we can have you removed from the aircraft. Your choice." The threat hung in the cabin air like poison. Alyssa Carter, honor student, MIT scholarship recipient, daughter of one of the most powerful cybersecurity executives in America, stood surrounded by federal law enforcement treating her like a criminal because a bigoted passenger felt uncomfortable sharing first class with a black teenager. She reached into her backpack and pulled out her phone. "I'd like to make one call," she said quietly. Reynolds laughed. "This isn't a police station. You don't get a phone call." "Actually," Alyssa said, her voice carrying a new note. Not anger, but something far more dangerous: certainty. "I'd like to call my father." The escalation reached its crescendo as the first-class cabin transformed into a battlefield of assumptions, authority, and racial anxiety. What had begun as one passenger's discomfort had metastasized into a full-scale confrontation involving federal law enforcement, flight crew, and a growing audience of recording passengers. Air Marshal Reynolds seized Alyssa's phone before she could dial, his training kicking in with the paranoid efficiency of post-9/11 security theater. "No unauthorized communications during a security investigation." "That's my daughter you're manhandling." The voice came from Seat 1A, where Dr. Patricia Williams, a federal judge, had been watching the proceedings with growing alarm. Her judicial experience had taught her to recognize racial profiling when she saw it, and this case was textbook discrimination. "Ma'am, please remain in your seat," Reynolds commanded, but his authority was beginning to fracture under the weight of mounting opposition. Captain Foster found himself losing control of his aircraft before it had even left the ground. The delay was approaching 30 minutes. Ground control was demanding explanations, and his first-class cabin had become a circus of accusation and counter-accusation. "Everyone needs to calm down," Foster announced, his voice carrying over the growing chaos. "Miss, you can use the aircraft phone to call whoever you need to call, but this conversation is going to be brief, and then you're moving to coach." Alyssa walked to the aircraft phone with the measured pace of someone who had endured enough humiliation for one day. She dialed a number she knew by heart, her fingers steady despite the circus surrounding her. The phone rang once, twice. "David Carter." The voice on the other end was warm, familiar, tinged with the slight concern of a father receiving an unexpected call from his daughter mid-flight. "Dad, it's Alyssa." "I'm having some trouble on the flight." Rebecca Miller leaned forward in her seat, eager to hear this conversation that would surely expose the teenager's deception. Captain Foster stood with his arms crossed, ready to move this situation along. Air Marshal Reynolds positioned himself to monitor the call for any suspicious content. None of them understood that they were about to witness the destruction of their assumptions in real time. "What kind of trouble, sweetheart?" David Carter's voice carried through the cabin phone speaker, audible to the growing crowd of onlookers. Alyssa took a breath and began to explain, her voice calm and factual. "I'm in first class, seat 2A. A passenger named Rebecca Miller complained about my presence here. She questioned how I could afford the ticket and suggested I might be using a stolen credit card. The Air Marshal and Captain want to move me to coach because Mrs. Miller says she feels unsafe with me on the plane." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When David Carter spoke again, his voice had changed. The warmth remained, but it was now underlaid with something else. A tone that suggested significant experience dealing with discrimination and the power to do something about it. "Alyssa, are you physically safe right now?" "Yes, Dad." "Good. Now, I'd like to speak with the captain." Foster stepped forward, assuming he was about to deal with an angry parent who could be quickly placated with promises of upgraded tickets or frequent flyer miles. "This is Captain Foster. Sir, your daughter isn't in any trouble, but we need to resolve this situation so we can depart on schedule." "Captain Foster, my name is David Carter. I'm the CEO of ShieldNet Systems. Before we discuss my daughter's situation, I want to make sure you understand who you're dealing with." The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Rebecca Miller's triumphant expression began to waver. Air Marshal Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Captain Foster's casual demeanor evaporated as he processed what he'd just heard. ShieldNet Systems. Every airline executive in America knew that name. They were the cybersecurity firm that had revolutionized aviation digital security after a series of high-profile hacking incidents. Their contracts with major airlines were worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. "Mr. Carter," Foster began, his voice suddenly much more respectful, "I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize that the 17-year-old black girl you're harassing is the daughter of one of your company's most important partners?" David Carter's voice was crisp, professional, and absolutely lethal. "You didn't realize that she's a computer science prodigy who's already published research on aviation cybersecurity? You didn't realize that she's been developing security protocols that protect the very systems you're using to fly that aircraft?" The revelation hit the cabin like a shockwave. Rebecca Miller's face had gone ashen. She'd built her complaint on assumptions about who belonged in first class, and those assumptions had just been obliterated by reality. Reynolds found himself facing a situation his training had never prepared him for. He'd just confiscated the phone of a teenager whose father was a major government contractor, whose security clearance was higher than his own, whose company quite literally kept American aviation safe from cyber threats. Dr. Patel continued recording, recognizing he was documenting what would likely become a landmark case of racial profiling. Other passengers were torn between secondhand embarrassment and anticipation of what would happen next. "Mr. Carter, Captain Foster said, his voice now carefully controlled. "If you could give me a moment to sort this out." "Captain Foster, there's nothing to sort out. My daughter paid for her seat. She's done nothing wrong. She's been the victim of racial profiling, and now you and your crew have compounded that discrimination with your own biased response." The words hung in the cabin air like a judgment. David Carter continued, his voice gaining momentum and moral authority. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to my daughter. You're going to ensure she's treated with the respect and dignity that every passenger deserves, and then you're going to explain to your airline's executive team why ShieldNet Systems is going to be reconsidering its partnership with a company that tolerates this kind of discrimination." The collapse came swiftly and completely. Within minutes of David Carter's identity being revealed, the entire power structure of Flight 447 had inverted. The teenager who'd been treated as a threat was suddenly the most important person on the aircraft. Captain Foster's hands shook as he accepted a call from airline headquarters. "CEO." Richard Sterling's voice crackled through the radio with barely contained panic. "Foster, what the hell is happening up there? I've got David Carter's legal team on line 1 and the NAACP on line 2. Air Marshal Reynolds found himself being questioned by his own supervisors, who were trying to understand how a routine passenger dispute had escalated into a federal civil rights incident. His career was flashing before his eyes as he realized he'd just racially profiled the daughter of one of the federal government's most trusted cybersecurity contractors. Rebecca Miller sat in stunned silence, the magnitude of her mistake becoming clear. She'd built her complaint on the assumption that a black teenager couldn't legitimately afford first class, and that assumption had just destroyed her credibility and potentially her reputation. Dr. Patel stopped recording and approached Alyssa, introducing himself as a witness who documented the entire incident. "Young lady, I want you to know that what happened here was wrong, and I'll testify to that fact if needed." Other passengers began offering similar support, their earlier silence replaced by belated solidarity. The social dynamics of the cabin had shifted completely, with Alyssa now receiving the deference and respect that should have been hers from the beginning. Flight 447 was officially grounded. Sterling made the decision to cancel the flight entirely, citing security concerns that everyone understood meant we need time to figure out how to minimize the legal and public relations disaster we've created. Within hours, video of the incident had gone viral. First class. While Black began trending on social media, with Dr. Patel's footage serving as damning evidence of institutional discrimination. The airline's stock price dropped 12% in extended trading as investors recognized the potential liability of discriminating against the daughter of a major contractor. Rebecca Miller found herself banned from the airline pending a comprehensive review of the incident. Her social media accounts were flooded with criticism as her identity became public. The woman who'd felt entitled to question a teenager's presence in first class now faced questions about her own fitness to participate in civilized society. Air Marshal Reynolds was suspended pending a federal investigation into whether he'd violated Alyssa's civil rights. His 15-year career in law enforcement was suddenly in jeopardy because he'd chosen to prioritize the complaints of a bigoted passenger over the rights of an innocent teenager. But the most significant consequence was systemic. David Carter's legal team announced a comprehensive lawsuit targeting not just individual actors but the policies and training that had allowed the discrimination to occur. ShieldNet Systems threatened to terminate its contracts with any airline that couldn't demonstrate meaningful reform. The airline industry, already sensitive to public relations disasters, scrambled to implement new anti-discrimination training and oversight procedures. What had begun as one passenger's prejudice had exposed the systemic nature of bias in commercial aviation. Alyssa Carter stood at the center of it all, no longer the victim of discrimination, but the catalyst for change. Her dignity under pressure had transformed a personal attack into a public reckoning. Her father's phone call had grounded not just one flight, but an entire industry's assumptions about who belonged where. 1 week after Flight 447 was grounded, David Carter sat in his corner office overlooking Manhattan's financial district, fielding calls from airline executives, civil rights organizations, and media outlets. The incident had transformed from a family crisis into a national conversation about racial profiling in commercial aviation. "The thing that makes me angriest," he told CNN's Anderson Cooper during a primetime interview, "isn't what they did to my daughter. It's what they do to other people's daughters every day, people who don't have the resources or connections to fight back." Alyssa had returned to MIT, where she'd become something of a celebrity among her classmates. But she carried herself with the same quiet dignity she'd displayed in the first-class cabin, focused more on her studies than her newfound fame. The airline had moved quickly to contain the damage. CEO Richard Sterling personally apologized to the Carter family and announced the creation of the Alyssa Carter STEM Scholarship, a $1 million program designed to support underrepresented minorities pursuing technology careers. More substantively, the airline implemented comprehensive bias training for all employees, established an independent ombudsman office to investigate discrimination complaints, and revised its security protocols to prevent racial profiling. Rebecca Miller had largely disappeared from public view, her social media accounts deleted, her frequent flyer status permanently revoked. She'd become a cautionary tale about the consequences of privilege unchecked by empathy or self-awareness. Air Marshal Reynolds faced federal civil rights charges and the end of his career in law enforcement. His case would serve as precedent for holding security personnel accountable when they allowed bias to override professional judgment. But the changes extended far beyond one airline or one incident. The Department of Transportation announced new guidelines for investigating discrimination complaints. The NAACP established a new travel advisory system to warn travelers about airlines with poor civil rights records. Dr. Patel, whose recording had provided crucial evidence of the discrimination, was invited to speak at medical conferences about the role of witness testimony in combating systemic bias. His decision to document rather than simply observe had proven crucial in establishing the facts of the case. "I've seen discrimination my entire career," he told a gathering of physicians. "But I learned that being a passive witness makes you complicit in the system. Sometimes you have to be willing to stand up and testify to what you've seen." The incident had revealed something important about power and prejudice in America. Alyssa Carter's experience was unique, not because discrimination had occurred. That happened daily to travelers of color across the country. It was unique because her family had the resources and connections to fight back effectively. David Carter used his platform to advocate for travelers who lacked similar advantages. ShieldNet Systems established a legal defense fund to support victims of travel discrimination, regardless of their economic status. "Real justice isn't about my daughter getting an apology," he said during a speech at the National Urban League annual conference. "Real justice is about creating systems that protect everyone's daughters, everyone's sons, everyone's dignity." The changes were already visible. Airlines began publishing diversity data in their annual reports. Flight attendants received enhanced training on recognizing and preventing discriminatory behavior. Air marshals faced new oversight procedures and regular bias audits. But perhaps the most important change was cultural. The incident had sparked conversations in families across America about discrimination, dignity, and the responsibility to speak up when witnessing injustice. Alyssa Carter, meanwhile, had returned to her AI security research with renewed purpose. Her senior project, ironically, focused on developing algorithms to detect and prevent discriminatory treatment in customer service interactions. "Technology can't solve racism," she told a gathering of computer science students. "But it can make discrimination more visible, harder to deny, and easier to prosecute." Her work was already being tested by several major corporations seeking to audit their own customer service practices for bias. The teenager who'd been treated as a security threat was now developing the tools to protect others from similar treatment. The first-class cabin incident had ended her childhood innocence about America's commitment to equality, but it had also revealed her own power to create change. She'd learned that dignity wasn't just about how you responded to discrimination, it was about how you used that experience to prevent others from facing the same treatment. Every time you witness discrimination and stay silent, you become part of the system that perpetuates it. But every time you speak up, record evidence, or support a victim, you become part of the solution. The power to create change doesn't require a corner office or a federal contract. It requires the courage to act when action is needed. Alyssa Carter's story reminds us that justice isn't about who has power. It's about how we choose to use whatever power we have. Whether you're a teenager with a phone camera, a doctor willing to testify, or a parent with connections, your voice matters when it's raised on behalf of what's right. The next time you see someone being treated unfairly because of their race, their age, or their appearance, remember that your silence is a choice. Your action is also a choice. Choose to be part of the solution, because dignity can't be bought, but it can be defended. Justice can't be guaranteed, but it can be demanded. And change can't be assumed, but it can be created. One phone call, one witness, one act of courage at a time. 3 months after the incident, Alyssa Carter stood before a congressional subcommittee on transportation and infrastructure, her testimony part of a broader investigation into discriminatory practices in commercial aviation. The same composed 17-year-old who'd endured humiliation in first class now commanded the attention of federal lawmakers. "Honorable members of this committee," she began, her voice carrying the same steady confidence that had sustained her during the flight. "What happened to me on Flight 447 wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of systemic bias that affects thousands of travelers every year." Behind her, David Carter watched with pride as his daughter transformed personal trauma into public advocacy. The months since the incident had been challenging for their family. Death threats, invasive media attention, and the constant pressure of being symbols rather than simply people. But Alyssa had channeled that pressure into purpose. According to data compiled by the Travelers' Rights Coalition, passengers of color are 73% more likely to be subjected to additional screening, 45% more likely to have their credentials questioned, and twice as likely to be removed from flights for disruptive behavior that would be overlooked in white passengers. The statistics landed heavily in the committee room. Representative Maria Gonzalez, the subcommittee chair, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Ms. Carter, in your research, have you identified specific policy changes that could address these disparities?" Alyssa had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with civil rights attorneys and aviation policy experts to develop concrete recommendations. "Yes, Congresswoman. First, mandatory body cameras for all air marshals and senior flight crew during passenger interactions. Second, independent oversight boards with community representation to review discrimination complaints. Third, public reporting requirements for airlines on passenger complaint demographics." The recommendations weren't just theoretical. They represented lessons learned from her family's experience navigating the aftermath of Flight 447. David Carter's legal team had identified gaps in accountability that allowed discrimination to flourish in the shadows of corporate bureaucracy. Additionally, Alyssa continued, we need federal standards for bias training that go beyond checking boxes. Current programs often reinforce stereotypes rather than challenging them. The training should be developed by people who understand discrimination from the receiving end, not just the preventing end. Her words carried weight beyond her years, the authority of someone who'd been forced to mature rapidly in the public spotlight. The MIT freshman who'd once just wanted to code in peace had become a reluctant but effective advocate for systematic change. In the audience, Rebecca Miller sat in the back row, barely recognizable from the confident woman who'd started the confrontation months earlier. She'd requested permission to attend the hearing as part of her court-ordered community service, her presence serving as a living reminder of the human cost of unchecked prejudice. The legal consequences for Rebecca had been severe but not devastating. Her lawsuit settlement with the Carter family included not just financial compensation, but mandatory participation in bias training and community service with civil rights organizations. She'd lost her job at a financial services firm after the incident went viral, but she'd also gained something unexpected: self-awareness about her own prejudices and their impact on others. "I want to address something that's been troubling me," Rebecca said when given an opportunity to speak. "I've heard people defend my actions that day by saying I was just concerned about safety, but that's not true. I was uncomfortable seeing a young black woman in a space I considered mine, and I used safety as an excuse to act on that discomfort." Her voice trembled slightly as she continued. "I told myself I was being reasonable, asking legitimate questions. But the truth is, I never would have questioned a white teenager's presence in first class. I never would have demanded to see their credit card or speculated about stolen tickets. My actions weren't about safety. They were about maintaining a social order that made me comfortable." The admission was powerful precisely because it came from the person who'd caused the harm. Rebecca's court-mandated participation in restorative justice programs had forced her to confront the real motivations behind her behavior, stripping away the rationalizations that had allowed her to see herself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. "Ms. Miller's honesty is important," Alyssa said when asked to respond, "because it demonstrates something crucial. Discrimination often comes from people who don't see themselves as discriminatory. The most dangerous bias isn't the obvious hatred, it's the subtle assumptions that seem reasonable to the people making them." The hearing continued for 2 more hours, with testimony from airline executives, civil rights advocates, and other victims of travel discrimination. But the most powerful moments came from the intersection of Alyssa's analytical mind and Rebecca's forced self-reflection. The victim and perpetrator united in their commitment to preventing similar incidents. As the session concluded, Representative Gonzalez announced the subcommittee's intention to draft comprehensive aviation civil rights legislation. "The Alyssa Carter Aviation Equality Act," she said, "will establish federal standards for preventing discrimination in commercial air travel and ensure accountability when those standards are violated." The proposed legislation represented the kind of systemic change that David Carter had envisioned when he first received his daughter's phone call. It would create legal frameworks to protect future travelers from the treatment his daughter had endured, transforming a personal injustice into a public good. Outside the hearing room, Alyssa was surrounded by reporters and advocates, but she seemed most interested in talking with other young people who'd traveled to Washington to witness the proceedings. A group of high school students from a predominantly black school in Baltimore had taken a bus to attend, their presence serving as a reminder that the stakes of this fight extended far beyond one family's experience. "The thing I want you to understand," Alyssa told them, "is that this isn't really about me or my family. It's about making sure that when you achieve success, when you earn your way into spaces that have traditionally excluded people who look like us, you're treated with the dignity you deserve." Her words resonated because they came from someone who'd lived the experience she was describing. At 17, she'd already faced down federal law enforcement, corporate executives, and congressional committees. She'd learned to navigate systems designed to intimidate and silence, emerging not just unbroken, but strengthened. The students asked about her future plans, whether she intended to pursue politics or law in addition to her computer science studies. Alyssa smiled at the questions, recognizing the assumption that her advocacy work represented a career pivot rather than an extension of her technical interests. "I'm still going to be a computer scientist," she said, "but I'm going to be a computer scientist who understands how technology can either perpetuate bias or help eliminate it. The algorithms we build, the systems we design, they all have the potential to either expand opportunity or restrict it. It was a sophisticated understanding of technology's social impact, informed by her personal experience with discrimination, but grounded in rigorous technical knowledge. She represented a new generation of technologists who refused to see their work as politically neutral, who understood that code could be as powerful as law in shaping social outcomes. As the crowds dispersed and the students boarded their bus back to Baltimore, Alyssa stood with her father on the Capitol steps, looking out over a city built on promises of equality that were still being fulfilled. The journey from Flight 447 to this congressional hearing had taken only 3 months, but it had transformed not just their family, but the entire conversation around discrimination in American travel. "Are you proud of what we've accomplished?" David asked his daughter. Alyssa considered the question carefully. "I'm proud that something good came from something terrible. But I'll be prouder when no other 17-year-old has to go through what I went through just to sit in a seat they paid for." It was the kind of measured response that had made her such an effective advocate, ambitious enough to drive change, humble enough to remember that the work was far from finished. The Alyssa Carter Aviation Equality Act would take months to pass through Congress and even longer to implement. Real change would require sustained effort from people who understood that justice was not a destination, but a direction. The teenager who'd been treated as a threat had become a voice for transformation, proof that dignity under pressure could reshape not just individual lives, but entire industries. Her story would continue beyond viral videos and congressional hearings in the lives of future travelers who would fly with greater security and respect because one young woman refused to accept discrimination as the price of her presence in first-class America.